The Pacific breeze ruffled my hair as I stood on the deck of the research vessel Cassiopeia, watching the setting sun sink into the endless sea. The crew of 23 was preparing for the night shift. I, Veronika Severtseva, a 32-year-old marine biologist, was leading the third expedition to the Palawan Islands in the Philippines. Our mission was routine, studying coral reefs and documenting the impact of climate change on the marine ecosystem. No one foresaw that this night would change my life forever. The first drops of rain fell on the deck around 9 p.m. Captain Miroslav, an experienced sailor with 25 years of service, did not seem worried. "Just a tropical downpour," he said. I returned to my cabin to check the samples I had collected during the day and enter the data in the research log. The weather worsened with alarming speed. In 30 minutes, a moderate rain turned into a raging storm. The ship began to rock with such force that flasks and test tubes fell from my desk, breaking on the floor. The captain's voice came over the intercom, ordering everyone to immediately put on life jackets and go up to the main deck. When I got outside, the rain was lashing with such force that it was difficult to breathe. Waves at least 8 meters high crashed onto the ship. The sky was lit up by flashes of lightning, momentarily illuminating the fear-distorted faces of the crew members. The squally wind drowned out the cries of the people. "Hold on," Gustav shouted from the top of his voice, clinging to the handrail. "It's a typhoon. A typhoon at this time of year." It was impossible. Unthinkable. Our meteorologist swore that the weather would be perfect for the entire expedition. The next minutes turned into chaos. A huge wave hit the starboard side, tilting the ship. I heard a metallic screech. "What?" Something in the ship's structure gave way. There was a deafening crack, and the deck shook under my feet. "A hole!" A cry came from the bridge. "Everyone to the lifeboats." Immediately, I rushed to the nearest boat, where 7 people had already gathered. My colleague Ernest tried to cast off the mooring lines, but another wave washed him overboard. His cry disappeared in the roar of the storm. I froze in place, unable to believe what was happening. "Veronika, come here." Amina, our ship's doctor, called to me, holding out her hand from the neighboring boat. I took a step towards her, but at that moment the ship tilted sharply. I lost my balance and fell, hitting my head on a metal ledge. A sharp pain pierced my temple. Black spots swam before my eyes. The last thing I remember was being picked up by a wave and carried away from the ship. When I came to, there was pitch darkness all around. I was holding on to some debris. A piece of wood, perhaps a piece of furniture from Cassiopeia. The storm was still raging, but its epicenter seemed to have shifted. The rain continued to lash, but the waves were lower. I could not see the ship or the lifeboats, only the endless blackness of the water around me. My head was throbbing with pain, my clothes were soaked through, but the life jacket kept me afloat. I screamed for help until my voice was lost, but only the sound of the sea answered me. I don't know how many hours I spent in the water. Sometimes I lost consciousness, then came to again. When the first rays of the sun cut through the clouds, I saw a dark strip of land on the horizon. Gathering my last strength, I began to row towards it, using the wreckage as a primitive floating craft. The waves helped me, carrying me to the shore. When there were about 100 meters left to the land, I noticed a coral reef. The surf threw me onto the sharp ledges, tearing the skin on my arms and legs. I screamed in pain, but continued to struggle until finally I felt sand under my feet. Having climbed onto the shore, I fell to my knees and burst into tears. Around me stretched a deserted beach, surrounded by jungle. No trace of civilization, no signs of other survivors. Only then did I realize the scale of the catastrophe. Cassiopeia sank, and I was the only one washed up on this shore. The sun was rising above the horizon, illuminating my new reality. My head was spinning from dehydration and exhaustion. I didn't know where I was or if anyone else had survived. One thing was clear: if I wanted to live to be rescued, I would have to fight for my life. I stood up on trembling legs and looked at the boundless ocean, which had been my workplace only yesterday, and now had become my prison. Thus began my first day out of 1095 on an uninhabited island. The first day on the island passed in a fog. I wandered along the shore, stumbling and falling, hoping to find other survivors or traces of civilization. My body was covered in abrasions, a sharp pain shot through my temple, and my throat was dry from thirst. I took off my life jacket and now dragged it behind me. The only proof that my past life was not a dream. By midday, the tropical sun began to mercilessly burn my skin. I realized that if I didn't find fresh water in the next few hours, I simply wouldn't survive. Gathering my last strength, I headed toward the green wall of the jungle that lined the beach. The first step into the tropical forest was a step into another world. The scorching heat gave way to a humid stuffiness. The sounds of the jungle were deafening, the chirping of insects, the cries of invisible birds, the rustling of leaves. I moved slowly, pushing aside the dense thickets with my hands and listening for sounds that could indicate the presence of water. After 20 minutes of wandering, I heard this quiet murmur. Stumbling over tree roots, I wandered toward the sound and soon came to a small stream trickling between the stones. I fell to my knees and greedily began to drink, not caring how clean the water was. At that moment, quenching my thirst was more important than any fears. Having quenched my thirst, I examined my wounds. The cuts from the coral looked inflamed, and there was dried blood on my temple. I washed the wounds with cold water, wincing in pain. We had a course in first aid at the university, but theory is one thing and practice is another, especially when you are the patient. With the onset of twilight, fear overwhelmed me again with force. I understood that a night in the jungle could be deadly, but returning to an open beach with no shelter seemed even worse. In the end, I decided to settle down for the night by the stream, collecting fallen leaves for an improvised bedding. That night, I did not close my eyes. Every rustle made me shudder. Every shadow seemed like a predator. I thought about my colleagues, about the ship, about whether they were looking for us. Scraps of knowledge about survival, gleaned from books and films, swirled in my head. 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. This survivalist mantra had now become my reality. At dawn on the second day, I made a decision. I needed to return to the beach and try to send out a distress signal. I filled a makeshift water tank, folded my life jacket in half, and headed back to shore. As I emerged from the forest, I saw that the wreckage of Cassiopeia had washed up on the beach. Among the debris, I found a plastic container, some boards, a piece of tarpaulin, and, lo and behold, a waterproof tool bag. Inside were a multi-tool, a coil of rope, a roll of duct tape, and some chemical glow sticks. These finds felt like treasure. I spent the entire day collecting everything I could find. By evening, I had built a crude shelter out of boards and tarpaulin at the edge of the beach near the tree line. It was a pitiful sight, but it provided some protection from the elements. On the third day, I tried to start a fire. At university, during the expedition training course, we were taught basic survival skills, including making age by friction. But in practice, everything turned out to be much more difficult. My fingers were rubbed raw before I managed to get the first spark. When a tiny flame finally caught on a dry bird's nest that I found in the forest, I burst into tears of relief. The fire became my salvation and comfort. I kept it going around the clock, adding dry branches and coconut shells. The smoke rose upward, a signal for any passing ship or plane. On the fourth day, hunger became unbearable. I found a few coconuts, but it was difficult to break their hard shells. After many attempts, I adapted to cracking them on a stone. Coconut meat and milk became my first food on the island. That same day, I decided to explore the coastline more thoroughly. After walking about 2 kilometers north, I found a small bay, protected from the wind by rocks. Here the sea had thrown up more debris. A box of tinned food, Most of the cans were damaged, but 5 were intact. Plastic bottles, a piece of canvas and, most importantly, a sealed container with a first aid kit. In the first aid kit I found antiseptic, bandages, painkillers, antibiotics and even a small sewing kit. This was real luck. I immediately treated my wounds and took antibiotics, fearing infection. On the 5th day, I decided to move the camp to the bay. The new place was better protected from the elements, closer to fresh water. I found a small waterfall flowing from the cliff. And, importantly, there was a natural platform on an elevation from which there was a view of the sea. I spent the whole day building a more durable shelter. Using the boards, tarps, and ropes I found, I built a crude shelter, securing it between 2 trees. I laid the floor with flat stones to keep out insects and moisture. On the 6th day, I made my first attempt at fishing. Using a piece of metal found in the wreckage, I fashioned a crude harpoon with a multi-tool. The results were modest. I managed to catch only 1 small fish, but even that felt like a triumph. I roasted it over the fire, and it was the most delicious meal of my life. By the end of the first week, I had established some semblance of a routine. In the morning, I checked the fish traps I had made from found netting. I collected coconuts and edible berries, which I had learned to recognize thanks to my knowledge of botany. During the day, I worked on improving the shelter or exploring the island. In the evening, I tended the signal fire and cooked food. But every night, as I lay under my rudimentary shelter, I listened to the sounds of the jungle and wondered, will they ever find me? Does anyone know I'm still alive? And most importantly, how long can I survive in this green wilderness? I didn't know the answers, but I knew one thing. To survive, I would have to become stronger, smarter, and more resilient than I'd ever been. By the end of my first month on the island, my life had acquired some structure. The initial shock and despair had given way to a pragmatic acceptance of reality. I knew the search had probably already been called off. In a disaster like this, it's rare to search for more than 2 weeks, especially if there's no sign of survivors. My shelter evolved from a rudimentary shelter to something more substantial. Using salvaged debris and natural materials, I built a hut with a raised floor, walls of woven branches, and a roof of palm fronds. Inside, I created a raised sleeping area and even built some sort of shelves to store found items and supplies. Food became my primary concern. I decided to save the canned goods from the first aid kit for emergencies. Instead, I focused on harnessing local food sources. Coconuts, wild fruits, and berries formed the basis of my diet. I learned to identify edible plants using my knowledge of botany and the process of elimination. I would try a tiny piece first, wait for my body to react, and only then decide to eat more. Fishing became a daily ritual. I improved my primitive gear, using line made from loose rope and hooks fashioned from scrap metal found in the woods. On good days, I would catch 2 or 3 fish, which I would roast over the fire or dry in the sun for storage. Water was no longer an issue. I found several sources of fresh water on the island and dug a small well near the camp, which was filled with groundwater. I used found plastic bottles and containers for storage. Fire became my faithful companion. I learned to keep the embers glowing under a layer of ash so as not to waste energy on daily kindling. It was not only a source of heat and an opportunity to cook food, but also a psychological support, a symbol of human civilization in the wild. On the 45th day, an event occurred that almost cost me my life. Exploring the eastern part of the island, I stepped on a rotten log, which broke under my weight. My foot fell in, and a sharp branch dug deep into my calf. A cry of pain echoed through the jungle. Blood spurted from the wound as I struggled to free my leg. Using my shirt as a tourniquet, I somehow stopped the bleeding and hobbled back to the camp. Every step was torture. When I reached the hut, I washed the wound with water and treated it with antiseptic from the first aid kit. The wound was deep and needed stitches. With trembling hands, using a needle and thread from a sewing kit, I gave myself 6 stitches, biting my lips to keep from screaming in pain. The next week passed in fever. The wound became infected, despite the antibiotics. I swung between consciousness and delirium, barely finding the strength to crawl to water. In moments of clarity, I changed the bandages and took medications, knowing that if the infection spread, I was finished. On the 7th day, the fever finally broke. I was exhausted, dehydrated, but alive. This injury was a harsh lesson. There is no room for error on the island. Every carelessness can be fatal. After my recovery, I became much more careful, made crude crutches to take the weight off my injured leg, and devoted time to making a calendar. I began making notches on the inside wall of the hut to mark the days that passed. This not only helped me keep track of time, but also kept my sanity. By the end of the 3rd month, I had fully adapted to life on the island. My body had changed. I had lost at least 10 kilograms. My skin had become rough and darkened by the sun. My muscles had become stronger from constant physical work. I cut my long hair with a blade I found in my multi-tool. This made it easier to maintain hygiene. I developed a system for collecting rainwater using pieces of tarpaulin and plastic containers. I learned to cook food in different ways. Over an open fire in an earthen oven, a pit lined with hot stones and heated in the sun. For storing food, I built a crude cellar, a pit lined with stones and covered with a thick layer of leaves for insulation. Clothing became a serious problem. What I found myself in on the island quickly wore out. I tried to make clothes from plant fibers and the skins of small animals that I learned to catch in snares. But the results were far from ideal. In the end, I adapted, combining the remains of my clothes with found materials. Psychologically, the hardest thing was loneliness. The lack of human communication, even simple conversation, turned out to be harder than I could have imagined. I began to talk to myself, keep a diary on pieces of bark, and even created a friend. A coconut figurine with a painted face, which I named Friday after a literary character. The scars on my body multiplied, traces of cuts, burns, insect bites. Each of them told a story of survival, struggle, adaptation. My previous life, conferences, labs, colleagues seemed like a distant dream. On the 180th day, I made a complete exploration of the island. It turned out to be not as big as I initially thought. It was about 4 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. Most of it was dense jungle, but there were also open areas with tall grass, rocky outcrops, and a few beaches. I found no signs of human presence, no abandoned buildings or traces of visits by fishermen. This confirmed my fears. The island was located away from shipping lanes, making the chances of accidental rescue minimal. By the end of the 6th month, I stopped keeping the signal fire going daily, saving my strength and resources. Instead, I built a permanent signal on the highest point of the island out of brightly colored materials that would be visible from the air. From time to time, I still lit a large fire, especially when I noticed traces of airplanes in the sky, but they always flew too far. My life took on a measured rhythm. In the morning, I checked the traps and collected food. During the day, I repaired and improved my home or made necessary items. In the evening, I cooked dinner and wrote down the events of the day on pieces of bark. I learned to predict the weather by the behavior of animals and the shapes of clouds, to tell time by the position of the sun, to find my way in the jungle by barely noticeable landmarks. Nature no longer seemed hostile. It had become my home. When the 200th day on the island came, I realized that I no longer expected to be saved every day. I continued to fight, but I stopped living in anticipation. Instead, I focused on making my life here as comfortable and safe as possible. I became a part of this island, and it became a part of me. But somewhere deep inside, there was a glimmer of hope that one day I would see the silhouette of a ship on the horizon or hear the roar of an airplane flying straight toward me. Until then, all I could do was survive day after day in this green world cut off from civilization. At the end of my first year on the island, nature decided to remind me of its power. The rainy season began earlier than usual and with an intensity I had never seen before. The sky was covered with leaden clouds, and the rain did not stop for 7 days straight. My hut, which I had so carefully built and reinforced, could not withstand the onslaught of the elements. On the 5th day of continuous rain, the roof began to leak, and on the 6th, it collapsed under the weight of the accumulated water. I barely managed to jump out, grabbing the bare necessities: a knife, a flint, a supply of food and a first aid kit. Taking cover under an overhanging rock, I watched as the water washed away my camp. The stream turned into a seething torrent, which carried away part of my supply of tools. The fire, which I had so carefully maintained for months, went out. Everything that I had achieved in a year of hard work was destroyed in a few days. When the rain finally stopped, I returned to the place of my camp. The sight was depressing. Washed out earth, the ruins of huts, scattered things. I fell to my knees and for the first time in a long time allowed myself to cry. Not from fear or despair, but from fatigue and the knowledge that everything would have to be started over. But tears did not solve the problems. Gathering her will into a fist, Yana began to sort through the rubble and save what could still be saved. Among the mud and debris, I found my diary, wet but still legible. It was like a sign. My story continues. I decided not to rebuild the camp in the same place. Instead, I chose a high place about 200 meters from the old place, protected on 3 sides by cliffs. Here I began to build a new dwelling, using the experience of previous mistakes. This time I built a platform on stilts to protect against flooding. I made the walls from intertwined branches, coated with clay for greater strength. I laid the roof in several layers of palm leaves, giving it a steep slope for better water drainage. I dug drainage ditches around the hut to channel away rainwater. Starting a new fire was a real challenge. Everything was damp and finding dry kindling seemed impossible. I spent 2 days collecting dry palm hearts and the bark of certain trees that remained relatively dry even in the rain. When spark finally turned into a flame, I almost screamed with joy. The following weeks were spent rebuilding supplies and tools. Fish traps had to be built anew. The stock of edible plants was depleted by the flood, and I had to go deeper and deeper into the jungle in search of food. On one of these trips, I encountered a wild boar. A huge beast with terrifying fangs blocked my path on a narrow path. I had only a knife. Weak defense against an enraged animal weighing at least 100 kilograms. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in instantly. I grabbed a stick and started screaming loudly, waving my arms. To my surprise, the boar snorted and disappeared into the undergrowth. Only then did I notice that my legs were shaking and my heart was ready to jump out of my chest. This incident made me think about creating a more effective weapon. From strong wood, I made a spear with a fire-hardened tip. For hunting small animals, I made a bow and arrows. I trained daily, throwing a spear at the trunk of a fallen tree and shooting a bow at homemade targets. A month after the flood, I made my first successful hunt. I shot a wild chicken. As I plucked the bird with hands shaking from excitement, I felt a strange mixture of pride and guilt. In a past life, I was a convinced vegetarian, but here on the island such luxury was unavailable. I cooked the bird in an earthen oven, wrapped in leaves with wild herbs. It was a real feast. After weeks of semi-starvation, I ate only half, the rest I smoked over the fire for storage. With the arrival of the dry season, new challenges were not long in coming. The temperature rose to 35 degrees, and the humidity made every movement excruciating. Fresh water sources began to dry up. I was forced to cover greater and greater distances every day in search of water. To solve the problem, I created a moisture condensation system using large leaves and plastic containers. At night, The leaves collected dew, which flowed into the containers placed under me. This provided only a few sips of water, but in combination with other sources, it allowed me to survive. The heat brought another problem: insects. Mosquitoes, ants, spiders made my life a constant struggle. Particularly dangerous were scorpions, which were attracted to the shadow of my hut. After one stung me on the hand, causing excruciating pain and temporary paralysis of the fingers, I began carefully checking my shoes and bedding before use. To protect myself from insects, I made an ointment from the resin of certain trees mixed with ash. The smell was unpleasant, but it effectively repelled most bloodsuckers. Around the camp, I planted plants with a strong aroma, which, as I noticed, did not attract insects. On the 430th day of my stay on the island, I experienced another serious test: a tropical storm. The wind was so strong that it tore trees out by the roots. My hut survived this time, but was seriously damaged. Restoration took 2 weeks of hard work. After the storm, the ecosystem of the island changed noticeably. Some species of plants that served as my food were destroyed. The usual paths in the jungle disappeared under the fallen trees. I had to re-examine my territory, look for new sources of food and lay out new routes. By the end of the second year on the island, I learned to foresee the whims of nature. By the behavior of birds and insects, by the shape of clouds and the direction of the wind, I could predict the approach of a storm 2 to 3 days in advance. This gave me time to strengthen my shelter and make supplies. My body had fully adapted to the new conditions. I could spend hours under the scorching sun without experiencing discomfort. My muscles and legs had become so rough that I could freely walk on rocky areas. My vision and hearing had become sharper. I noticed the slightest movements in the undergrowth and caught the quietest sounds of the jungle. But the most important changes took place inside. I no longer perceived the island as a prison. It had become my home, and its inhabitants my neighbors. I learned to live in harmony with nature, to take only what was necessary and with gratitude. Of course, there were moments of despair. It became especially difficult on days when illness or injury confined me to bed, or when I saw in the distance the lights of a passing ship, too far away to notice my signals. At such moments, memories of my past life came flooding back with renewed vigor. Family, friends, the simple joys of civilization that I had previously taken for granted. But I had learned to cope with these emotions. I created rituals that helped me maintain my sanity. Daily journal entries, songs around the campfire, meditations at dawn. I talked to the birds and trees, gave names to the animals that regularly visited the area around my camp. By the beginning of my 3rd year on the island, I was no longer the frightened woman washed up on the shore after a shipwreck. I had become a part of this land, learned to read its signs and respect its laws. New challenges lay ahead, but now I was ready for them. My 3rd year on the island began with illness. I woke up one morning feeling weak and dizzy. By midday my temperature had risen, and by evening I was tossing and turning in delirium, unable to get out of bed. It was impossible to diagnose myself. The symptoms pointed to everything from tropical fever to banal food poisoning. There were a few fever-reducing tablets and broad-spectrum antibiotics left in the first aid kit. I took them with water and fell into a restless sleep. I had nightmares: a sinking ship, screaming colleagues, an endless ocean swallowing everything in its path. The next 5 days merged into one endless nightmare. I barely found the strength to crawl to the water supplies. The food ran out on the 3rd day of illness, but hunger did not bother me. Nausea did not allow me to think about food. The worst thing was the helplessness. If the condition worsened, there was nowhere to expect help. On the 6th day, the fever finally receded. I was exhausted to the limit. Every movement was difficult. When I left the hut, I saw that my camp was completely desolate. The fire went out, the fish traps were destroyed, the food supplies were spoiled by the heat. Recovery took weeks. I started small, collecting easily accessible fruits and berries, catching small fish near the shore. Gradually, my strength returned and I was able to resume my normal activities. This episode was a sobering reminder of my vulnerability. I decided to create an emergency kit in case something like this happened again. Extra canned food, bottles of water, any remaining medication. I put it all in a waterproof container and hid it in a safe place. In the middle of my 3rd year, I experienced the most terrible experience of my time on the island. In search of new food sources, I wandered into an unfamiliar part of the jungle. The terrain became increasingly mountainous. The path wound between rocks. Suddenly, the ground gave way from under my feet. I fell into a crevice camouflaged by vegetation. The fall was short but painful. I hit the rocky bottom, feeling a sharp pain in my left leg. Trying to stand caused such agony that I screamed, scaring a flock of birds from the nearby trees. When I felt my leg, I understood. The fracture of my shin was clear and obvious. Panic washed over me like a wave. The crevice was about 4 meters deep with steep walls. Getting out on my own with a broken leg seemed impossible. No one knew where I was. No one would come to my aid. I spent the first hour desperately trying to find a way out, screaming until I lost my voice, trying to cling to the ledges on the walls, but every movement caused a piercing pain in my leg. Finally, exhausted, I leaned against the wall and cried. When the first wave of panic subsided, I forced myself to think rationally. I had a knife, a flask of water, some dried fruit. The bottom of the crevice was dry, which was already lucky. I decided to use my shirt and the branches I found around to make a splint for my leg. Putting on a splint without outside help turned out to be a painful process. Every touch to my injured leg caused a wave of pain. Several times I lost consciousness, waking up in a cold sweat. But by evening the homemade splint was ready, and my leg was fixed in a relatively stable position. The night in the crevice was one of the longest in my life. The cold penetrated to the bones, the pain did not allow me to sleep. I heard rustlings and movements around. The nocturnal inhabitants of the jungle went out to hunt. Several times snakes slithered past me, and I froze, afraid to move. At dawn, I made a decision. Either I get out of here, or I die in this pit. Having examined the walls, the crevices more closely, I noticed that one of them had small protrusions and tree roots breaking through the stone. This was my only chance. Using a knife, I carved primitive crutches from wood. Then, overcoming the pain, I began a slow ascent. Leaning on my healthy leg and crutches, clinging to roots and ledges, I advanced centimeter by centimeter. Several times I fell, falling back and starting all over again. I don't know how many hours passed before my hands found the edge of the crevice. Gathering my last strength, I pulled myself up and rolled out onto solid ground. Lying on my back, looking at the sky through the treetops, I experienced pure happiness. I was alive. The way back to the camp took 2 days. I moved at a snail's pace, leaning on homemade crutches and stopping often to rest. Every meter was a victory of willpower over pain and fatigue. Returning to the camp, I began more serious treatment of my leg. I made the best splint from boards and ropes. I made a decoction of plants with an anti-inflammatory effect, which I used both for drinking and for compresses. I observed strict bed rest, going out only when absolutely necessary. The fracture healed slowly. For 2 months I was practically immobilized, relying on food supplies and nearby water sources. When I was finally able to remove the splint, my leg was weak and did not obey me well. It took several more weeks of rehabilitation before I could walk without a serious limp. This experience changed me. I became more careful and never went on long hikes without careful preparation. I always left signs at the camp indicating the direction of my movement. I carried an emergency kit with me: rope, an extra knife, a fire starter, bandages. By the 800th day on the island, I had reached the peak of my adaptation. My dwelling was a 2-level structure, the lower floor for storing supplies and taimen and tools. The upper one was for living. The roof collected rainwater, which flowed through bamboo gutters into a large container. Around the camp, I grew edible plants that I managed to domesticate: wild yams, bananas, coconut palms. I developed efficient methods of hunting and fishing, learned to make strong nets from plant fibers, which I set in narrow channels at low tide. For hunting birds, I used snares and traps of my own design. Clothing remained a problem. What I found myself in on the island had long since turned into rags. I experimented with weaving fabrics from the fibers of certain plants, but the results were rough and uncomfortable. Eventually, I adapted to wearing a minimum of clothing, protecting my body from the sun and insects with homemade ointments. Despite all the achievements in adaptation, the psychological tests were sometimes harder than the physical. Particularly excruciating were the moments when I saw traces of civilization: ships passing in the distance, planes in the sky. Each time I lit signal fires, waved improvised flags, screamed until I was hoarse, and each time I was not noticed. After several such disappointments, I fell into a deep depression. I lay in the hut for days, refusing food and water. Why fight if no one would ever find me? Maybe it would be easier to let nature take its course. A chance event brought me out of this state. Early one morning, as I was once again lying motionless, a small, bright green snake crawled into my hut. My instinct for self-preservation kicked in instantly. I jumped up and jumped away. The snake, no less frightened than I, quickly crawled away. This moment was a turning point. I realized that despite all the thoughts about the futility of the fight, my body still wanted to live. Something deep inside me refused to give in. And if even my body did not give in, then how could my soul? I returned to my routine with new determination. I continued to keep the signal fires burning, but I stopped focusing on salvation. Instead, I focused on living in the here and now, finding joy in the small things, in the beauty of a sunrise, the sweetness of a wild fruit, the coolness of seawater on a hot day. By the end of the 3rd year, I had reached a strange state of peace. I no longer saw myself as a victim of my circumstances. I was a survivor, an adapter, a winner. The island was no longer a prison. It was my home, my kingdom. Of course, I still dreamed of returning to civilization, but that dream no longer ruled me. I had learned to live in the moment, to see each day as a gift, not a test. On the last evening of the 3rd year, I sat on the beach, watching the sunset. The sun sank into the ocean, painting the sky and the water in shades of gold and purple. I thought about the past 95 days, about the struggle, the fear, the despair, but also about the strength, the courage, the hope. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Perhaps another year on the island, perhaps salvation. But I knew one thing: no matter what happened, I was ready to meet it with an open heart and an unbroken spirit. Day 1096 on the island began as usual. I woke up at dawn, washed myself with the dew I had collected overnight, had breakfast with fruit and went to check the fishing nets. Nothing foreshadowed that this day would change everything. Around midday, when I was returning to camp with the catch, my gaze was drawn to something unusual on the horizon. At first I thought it was not the first mirage during my stay here, but the dark dot did not disappear, but grew larger. A ship, a real ship, heading towards the island. My heart pounded so hard that I could hardly breathe. Having thrown down the catch, I rushed to the camp for signaling means. Along the way, I stumbled, fell, got up again and ran, not feeling the pain of bruises and scratches. The only thought pulsating in my head: if only I could make it in time. I hoped they wouldn't pass me by. When I reached the camp, I grabbed the signal kit I had prepared in advance: a large mirror to reflect the sun's rays, a red cloth, a piece of parachute found in the wreckage, and fire materials. Then I ran to the highest point of the island, where I had the best view of the sea. The ship was still there, and now I could see it more clearly: a small fishing boat, possibly Filipino. It was moving parallel to the shore, not getting any closer, but not moving away either. I had very little time. With trembling hands, I lit a fire, adding green leaves to create thick smoke. Then I began to signal with the mirror, directing the sun's rays toward the ship. I waved the red cloth, shouting, although I knew that from such a distance no one would hear me. 5 minutes, 10, 15. The ship continued moving, without changing course. Despair rolled in waves. Can't they see? Could they really pass by again, like dozens of ships before? And then I noticed a change. The ship began to turn towards the island. I redoubled my efforts, throwing everything that could burn and smoke into the fire. My heart was ready to jump out of my chest. The ship was getting closer. Now I could make out the figures of people on the deck. They saw me, noticed my signals. I was crying and laughing at the same time, unable to believe that this was really happening. When the ship came close enough to the shore, a small boat was lowered from it. 3 men began to row to the beach. I threw myself down from the cliff, almost breaking my neck on the steep descent, and rushed to the place where the boat was supposed to moor. The first meeting with people after 3 years of loneliness was surreal. I stood on the shore, tanned to blackness, dressed in homemade clothes from plant fibers and the remains of my old wading huddled with long tangled hair. The 3 Filipino fishermen looked at me with such amazement, as if they had seen a ghost. "Help!" I croaked in English. My voice was shaking with emotion. "I am a survivor of the Cassiopeia. The research vessel sank 3 years ago." They looked at each other, clearly not understanding everything I was saying, but getting the gist. One of them, probably the eldest, nodded and motioned for me to get into the boat. I hesitated only for a moment. I needed to get the most important thing from the camp. Quote, "Please wait, Sincamitas." I tried to explain myself in a mixture of English and Spanish, holding up 5 fingers. The fisherman nodded again, and I ran back to my camp. There I grabbed my journal, some personal talismans that had helped me survive all these years, and a photograph of my family, the only thing left from Cassiopeia, which I kept wrapped in a waterproof cloth. When I returned to the beach, I saw that the fishermen were still waiting for me. One of them handed me a bottle of water and a bag of rice cakes. The water from the plastic bottle seemed to me the most delicious drink I had ever tasted. The walk to the fishing boat was short, but for me it symbolized the passage between 2 worlds. I looked back at the island that had been my home and my prison all these years. A strange feeling came over me, a mixture of joy at being saved and sadness at leaving a place that, despite everything, difficulties, became a part of me. On board the fishing boat Maria Luisa I was greeted with kindness and curiosity. The captain, who introduced himself as Roman, spoke broken English. He explained that they were heading to another island to fish when they noticed my signals. "We thought maybe other fishermen were making signals that there was a good catch there," he smiled. "But then we saw that this man was waving. Very unusual." He offered me clean clothes, too big, but incredibly pleasant after my homemade rags, hot food and a place to rest in a small cabin. For the first time in 3 years, I slept on a real bed under a roof that did not leak, without fear of snakes and insects. Maria Luisa was heading to a small fishing port on the island of Palawan. The journey took 2 days, during which I gradually got used to the presence of people around. At first, I shuddered at every loud sound, had difficulty understanding human speech and could not sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. The sounds of the engine and the creaking of the ship's structures were too unusual. The fishermen treated me with respect and even some awe. For them, I was something of a miracle. A woman who had survived alone on an uninhabited island. They asked me through the captain about how I had gotten food, built a shelter, fought off illnesses. I answered briefly, not yet ready to share all the details of my experience. When we arrived at the port, Roman helped me contact the Philippine authorities. Events unfolded rapidly. First the local police, then the Coast Guard, and finally the Russian consulate. I repeated my story over and over again, showed my diary as proof, explained the coordinates of the island where I had been found. News of my rescue spread quickly. Journalists besieged the small hotel where I was temporarily housed. Representatives of the scientific community, colleagues from different countries, insurance companies, everyone wanted to talk to me, to find out the details of the sinking of the Cassiopeia and my survival. But the most emotional moment was a video call with my family. When I saw the faces of my parents, sister and brother on the screen, I couldn't hold back my tears. They had aged, changed, but they were the people I thought about every day on the island, whose images gave me the strength to fight. "Veronica, my daughter," cried my mother, touching the screen, as if trying to reach me across thousands of kilometers. "We never lost hope." "Never," my father, usually reserved, sobbed, not hiding his tears. My sister showed me her child, a nephew, whose existence I did not know. My brother swore that he would fly for me as soon as all the formalities were settled. A week after the rescue, I flew to my homeland. At the airport, I was met as a heroine, with flowers, cameras, applause. I felt awkward from such attention, still not accustomed to the noise, crowds of people, bright artificial lighting. The process of reintegration into society turned out to be more difficult than I expected. Modern technologies that had developed during the 3 years of my absence baffled me. Social norms seemed strange and artificial after a life where the only laws were the laws of survival. I shuddered from loud sounds, experienced panic attacks in closed spaces, woke up at night in cold sweat, thinking I was still on the island. Psychologists called it re-entry syndrome, a condition common in people who had experienced prolonged isolation. They said the symptoms would subside over time, but a part of me would always be connected to the island. The media interest in my story was enormous. I was offered contracts for books, films, interviews. At first, I refused everything, feeling overwhelmed. But gradually I realized that telling about my experience could help others who found themselves in extreme situations. I agreed to write a book about my survival experience, insisting that it be educational rather than sensational. In it, I described in detail the methods of obtaining food and water, building shelters, navigating the terrain, and providing first aid in the wild. 6 months after my return, I took part in an expedition to my island. The goal was not only to collect my remaining things, but also to conduct a scientific study of the ecosystem. Setting foot again on the familiar shore, I experienced a strange feeling, as if I had returned home after a long absence. My camp remained untouched except for the ravages of weather and animals. I showed the scientists the places where I had gathered food, the sources of fresh water, the natural landmarks that helped me find my way. For them it was just information, for me it was a whole life. Lived in struggle and loneliness. Before leaving, I spent the night in my old hut. Lying on the hard mat, looking at the stars through the cracks in the roof, I reflected on how much had changed in these 3 years. The island taught me many things: the strength of the human spirit, the importance of adaptability, the true cost of the comforts we take for granted in the civilized world. In the morning, when I left the island, I left a small totem of stones on the shore. A monument to my stay, my struggle, my rebirth. It was my gratitude to the island for the lessons of survival and for keeping me alive. Today, a year after being rescued, I am still adapting to normal life. Some of the habits I acquired on the island have remained with me. I wake up at dawn, use water and electricity sparingly. I plan my food supplies carefully. I can't throw away even a small piece of food, remembering the times when one fish was the difference between hunger and satiety. My job has changed. Now I teach a course on survival in extreme conditions at the university, sharing my experience with students and researchers who may find themselves in similar situations. I also collaborate with organizations involved in search and rescue, developing survival techniques and psychological support. Many people ask if I regret those 3 years lost on the island. My answer is always the same. Those years were not lost. They were lived differently than I planned, but each day there taught me something important. I learned my true limits and realized that they are much further than I thought. Sometimes, especially on noisy city days, I miss the silence of the island, the simplicity of life, where every action had a clear purpose to survive another day. But I would not want to go back there. Forever. I value the opportunity to choose, which was deprived of all these years. My story is not only a story about survival in extreme conditions. It is a story about the human ability to adapt, about the power of hope, about how much we can endure if we have no other choice. And most importantly, about the fact that even in the darkest hour, when all paths seem closed, there is always a chance that tomorrow a ship will appear on the horizon. On that desert island, I lost a lot, but gained something priceless. An understanding of what is really important in life. And for this lesson, I will always be grateful to fate, which threw me onto a small piece of land in the middle of an endless ocean.